The case of Marbury v. Madison, 1803, is considered the cornerstone of American constitutional law because it established the principle of judicial review. The story began when William Marbury, who had been appointed as a justice of the peace by President John Adams, did not receive his commission before Thomas Jefferson became president. Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver the documents. Marbury filed a petition directly in the Supreme Court, asking for a writ of mandamus to force Madison to hand over his commission. Chief Justice John Marshall faced a difficult situation. If the court ordered Madison to deliver the commission, Jefferson might simply ignore it, which would weaken the court. But if the court refused Marbury's request, it would appear powerless. Instead, Marshall found a brilliant solution. He ruled that while Marbury did have a right to the commission, the law giving the Supreme Court the authority to issue a writ of mandamus in this situation was unconstitutional. For the first time in American history, the court declared an act of Congress invalid because it conflicted with the Constitution. This decision gave birth to the principle of judicial review, meaning the Supreme Court has the authority to strike down laws that violate the Constitution. The ruling not only established the judiciary as an equal branch of government, but also ensured that the Constitution remained the supreme law of the land. Without Marbury v. Madison, the court might have remained weak and unable to check the power of Congress or the president. Visually, one can imagine the early years of the Republic when Washington was a small, developing capital and the institutions of government were still fragile. Yet through this single ruling, the court secured its role as the guardian of the Constitution. This case remains one of the most important in U.S. history because it laid the foundation for the balance of power that continues to define American democracy today. The case of McCulloch v. Maryland 1819 shaped the relationship between state and federal power. It arose when the state of Maryland tried to impose a tax on the second bank of the United States. James McCulloch, a cashier at the Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay the tax. Maryland argued that because the Constitution did not explicitly authorize Congress to create a bank, the bank was unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for a unanimous court, disagreed. He explained that under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress had implied powers that went beyond those specifically listed in the Constitution. Although the Constitution did not explicitly say Congress could create a bank, such an institution was useful for carrying out its powers, like collecting taxes and regulating commerce. Therefore, Congress had the authority to establish the bank. Marshall also addressed Maryland's taxes. He argued that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. If states could tax federal institutions, they could undermine or even eliminate them. That would contradict the Constitution's Supremacy Clause, which makes federal law higher than state law. The court ruled that states could not interfere with or control federal institutions. This decision was hugely important. It reinforced the supremacy of the federal government and gave Congress the flexibility to adapt to new challenges. It also prevented states from undermining national policies. Visually, one might imagine the map of the United States, with the federal government standing above individual states, ensuring unity. Cullochv. Maryland is still relevant today because it established two key principles. The federal government has implied powers, and federal law is supreme over state law. These ideas created a stronger, more unified system of government, which allowed the United States to grow and develop into a modern nation. The case of Dred v. Sandford 1857 is widely considered one of the most tragic and damaging Supreme Court decisions in American history. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived with his master in free territories where slavery was illegal. Scott argued that because he had lived on free soil, he should be recognized as a free man. He sued for his freedom in federal court. The Supreme Court, however, ruled against him in a decision written by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. The court declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. Taney went even further, stating that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, which effectively invalidated the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This decision sent shockwaves through the nation. In the South, it was celebrated as a victory for slaveholders. In the North, it outraged abolitionists and increased tensions between free and slave states. Visually, one can imagine a nation divided in two, free states and slave states, with Dred Scott caught in the middle, symbolizing the struggle for justice and humanity. The ruling deepened the national divide and accelerated the path to the Civil War. Although the decision denied Scott his freedom, history remembers him as a symbol of resistance against injustice. The Civil War and the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments eventually overturned the Dred Scott decision, abolishing slavery and granting citizenship to all persons born in the U.S. today. This case serves as a painful reminder of how the court can fail in its duty to uphold justice. It highlights the importance of constitutional amendments and civil rights struggles in correcting injustices created by bad rulings. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 created the infamous doctrine of separate but equal. It began when Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, deliberately sat in a whites-only railway car in Louisiana to challenge segregation laws. He was arrested, and his case eventually reached the Supreme Court. The court ruled against Plessy, stating that segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities provided for black and white people were equal. This decision gave legal approval to racial segregation in public spaces, including schools, transportation, and restaurants. In reality, facilities for black people were rarely equal and often far worse. The ruling entrenched racial inequality across the South and legitimized discriminatory practices for decades. Visually, one can imagine train stations, schools, and public restrooms divided with signs reading "whites only" in colored, symbolizing the deep division created by law. The Plessy decision was devastating for African Americans. It validated the Jim Crow system and ensured second-class citizenship for millions. For more than half a century, separate but equal remained the law of the land. It was not until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 that the court finally overturned Plessy, declaring segregation in public education unconstitutional. But the damage had already been done. Plessy v. Ferguson shows how the Supreme Court, when guided by prejudice, can uphold injustice and delay progress for generations. This case remains a reminder that equality on paper means nothing without equality in practice. It highlights the importance of continuing to fight against discrimination and ensuring that justice truly means fairness for all. The case of Brown v. Board of Education 1954 is one of the most celebrated decisions in Supreme Court history because it overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. The case began when Linda Brown, a young African-American girl in Topeka, Kansas, was denied admission to a white public school close to her home. Her parents, supported by the NAACP and lawyer Thurgood Marshall, challenged segregation in education. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The court declared that separate but equal is inherently unequal because it deprived African American children of equal educational opportunities. This ruling struck at the heart of legalized segregation. Visually, this case represents classrooms opening their doors to all children, regardless of race, symbolizing hope and progress. It was a major victory for the civil rights movement and inspired further actions to end racial discrimination in other areas of society. However, the decision was met with resistance. Many southern states delayed or defied desegregation, leading to years of struggle and sometimes violent opposition. Despite these challenges, Brown v. Board laid the foundation for future civil rights victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This case remains a cornerstone of American constitutional law. It showed that the Supreme Court could correct its own mistakes and move the nation toward justice and equality. Brown not only transformed the education system, but also proved that the law can be a powerful tool for social change. In 1966, the Supreme Court decided Miranda v. Arizona, a case that forever changed the rights of the accused. Ernesto Miranda was arrested in Phoenix, Arizona, for kidnapping and rape. During police questioning, he confessed without being told. He had the right to remain silent or to consult with an attorney. His lawyers argued that this violated his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court agreed and ruled that suspects must be informed of their rights before questioning. These rights include the right to remain silent, the warning that anything they say can be used against them, and the right to an attorney. These protections became famously known as the Miranda rights. Today, anyone who watches a police drama can instantly recognize the familiar warning: you have the right to remain silent. This case was groundbreaking because it balanced law enforcement authority with individual freedoms. It reminded America that the Constitution's protections apply not just in theory, but in everyday interactions with police. By enforcing these safeguards, the court emphasized the principle that justice must protect the vulnerable, not just punish the guilty. Miranda v. Arizona strengthened the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination and ensured fairer treatment for defendants across the nation. Just 1 year after Miranda, the court tackled an equally historic issue: interracial marriage. Richard and Mildred Loving, a white man and a black woman, were arrested in Virginia simply for being married. At the time, Virginia law banned interracial unions, labeling them illegal. The Lovings fought back, arguing that such laws violated the Constitution. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in their favor, declaring that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional. The court held that marriage is a fundamental right, and that denying it based on race violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. The decision was a major victory for civil rights. It dismantled centuries of racial prejudice embedded in law and affirmed that love, family, and marriage should never be restricted by color. Loving v. Virginia laid the groundwork for later struggles for marriage equality, became a symbol of the triumph of love over discrimination. In 1973, the Supreme Court made one of its most controversial and far-reaching decisions in Roe v. Wade. The case involved Jane Roe, a woman in Texas who challenged the state's ban on abortions. She argued that the law violated her constitutional right to privacy. The court ruled that the Constitution does indeed protect a woman's right to choose abortion, particularly in the early stages of pregnancy. This decision established a legal framework, balancing a woman's right to privacy with the state's interest in protecting life for decades. Roe v. Wade stood as the cornerstone of reproductive rights in the United States. It empowered women to make personal medical decisions without government interference, yet it also ignited a national debate that continues to shape politics, religion, and law to this day, whether praised or criticized. Roe v. Wade profoundly influenced American society by framing reproductive choice as a constitutional right and changing the landscape of women's health care. In the mid-1970s, America faced a political crisis known as Watergate. Journalists uncovered evidence of illegal activity tied to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. When prosecutors demanded tape recordings from the Oval Office, Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously against Nixon. The court declared that not even the president is above the law. While executive privilege exists, it cannot be used to obstruct justice or hide evidence in a criminal investigation. Shortly after this decision, Nixon resigned, the first and only U.S. president to do so. United States v. Nixon remains a landmark case reminding the nation that democracy depends on accountability. The ruling reinforced the principle of checks and balances, ensuring that no individual, regardless of power, can place themselves beyond the reach of the law. The final case in our journey is Obergefell v. Hodges. Decided in 2015, this case asked a historic question: should same-sex couples have the right to marry? Jim Obergefell and his partner John Arthur had legally married in another state, but Ohio refused to recognize their union. They challenged the state, arguing it violated their constitutional rights. In a 5-4 decision, The Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage is a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment. This landmark case legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, ensuring that love and commitment are treated equally under the law. Obergefell v. Hodges was a defining moment for LGBTQ+ rights. It symbolized the continuing evolution of liberty and equality in America, echoing earlier cases like Loving v. Virginia. Together, these 10 cases from Marbury v. Madison to Obergefell v. Hodges tell the story of America's legal journey toward justice, equality, and freedom. Each decision reshaped the nation, proving that the Constitution is not a static document, but a living promise to every generation.